In the remote hills of East Texas, where the pine forests meet endless plains, a series of camps once stood that promised salvation to the damned. Over 300 souls entered these redemption camps between 1845 and 1881, seeking forgiveness for their sins. Only a handful ever left alive. In whispers, the survivors spoke of purification rituals so extreme that death seemed merciful by comparison. Something far more horrifying than religious fanaticism was discovered by federal investigators who finally breached these camps in 1881. A secret cemetery was found containing the remains of nearly 200 victims, each bearing signs of prolonged torture. But the very foundations of frontier justice would be shaken by what they found in the Damnation family's private ledgers, revealing a criminal enterprise so elaborate that it had operated undetected for over 3 decades. Tonight, the complete story of the most successful serial killers in American frontier history and the twisted salvation they offered to the desperate and damned is what we uncover. Before the story of the Damnation family and their reign of terror disguised as salvation continues, let me ask you something. This channel isn't for everyone. Only for those brave enough to face the darkest chapters of American history. If you're one of the few who can handle stories like this, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what state you're listening from. Everything you thought you knew about faith, justice, and the price of redemption on the American frontier will be challenged by the truth we're about to uncover. The year was 1845, and as the 28th state, Texas had just joined the Union after nearly a decade as an independent republic. A vast, lawless expanse was the frontier, where desperate men and women fled from their pasts, seeking either redemption or ruin in equal measure. It was a land where a man's word was his bond, where justice often came at the end of a rope, and where religious fervor burned as hot as the summer sun. Along the dusty trails that connected sparse settlements scattered across hundreds of miles, word began to spread of 3 brothers who offered something precious to the damned. Immediate salvation through purification of the flesh. From Arkansas in early 1845, the Damnation family, preacher Malachi, evangelist Cornelius, and prophet Jebediah, had arrived in Texas, carrying letters of recommendation from various Baptist and Methodist congregations throughout the South. At 6 feet tall, preacher Malachi Damnation stood with penetrating gray eyes that seemed to look straight into a man's soul. Perfectly groomed, his black hair was always, and his voice possessed an otherworldly quality that could make hardened killers weep like children. The eldest and most charismatic of the 3 brothers at 35, he was capable of delivering sermons that left audiences both terrified and exhilarated. An uncanny ability to read the guilt written on a person's face was possessed by evangelist Cornelius, 2 years younger. He could identify a man's specific sins with such accuracy that many believed he had supernatural powers. An aesthetic appearance that reinforced his reputation for spiritual insight was given to him by his thin frame and hollow cheeks. What the brothers called confession extraction was the specialty of Cornelius, getting sinners to reveal their darkest secrets. Visions directly from the Almighty were claimed to be received by the youngest brother, prophet Jebediah. Built like a blacksmith at 28, he was, with massive hands that he claimed were blessed with healing powers. The physical aspects of purification were his role to oversee, ensuring that each penitent received exactly the level of suffering their sins demanded. Together, a network of redemption camps was established by them along the most desolate stretches of East Texas, where the cypress swamps met the piney woods, and civilization felt like a distant memory. Modest from the outside, the camps appeared, with canvas tents arranged in perfect circles around rough wooden crosses with a central fire pit where the brothers would preach to gatherings of desperate souls. Exactly what one would expect on the frontier was the clientele. Cowboys fleeing rustling charges, prostitutes seeking escape from brutal brothel owners, gamblers drowning in insurmountable debt, murderers running from vigilante justice, and deserters from both the Mexican War and various Indian conflicts. But a surprising number of seemingly respectable citizens were also attracted to the camps, merchants guilty of fraud, politicians fleeing corruption scandals, and even some legitimate seekers of spiritual guidance who had heard of the brothers' reputation for miraculous transformations. A harsh gospel of immediate purification was preached by the Damnation brothers that resonated with the violent, unforgiving nature of frontier life. Sin must be burned away like chaff in the fire, Malachi would thunder, his voice echoing through the pines as flames danced across his angular face. So the spirit can soar to eternal glory, the flesh must suffer. There are no shortcuts to salvation, only the narrow path of pain that leads to paradise. Throughout Texas and into neighboring states, their reputation for producing miraculous transformations spread. According to testimonials that appeared regularly in frontier newspapers, men entered the camps as hardened sinners and emerged as new creations, gentle as lambs, pure as mountain snow, ready to spread the gospel to the furthest corners of the earth. On a sweltering August night in 1847, the first disturbing reports began to surface, though few paid attention at the time. Barely alive, a cattle driver named Samuel Hartwell had stumbled into the town of Marshall, Texas, speaking in terrified whispers about what he had witnessed at a redemption camp near the mysterious waters of Caddo Lake. To those who had known him before his spiritual journey, Hartwell's appearance was shocking. Once a robust man in his 30s, he now appeared gaunt and prematurely aged, his hair having turned completely white. Uncontrollably, his hands shook, and he would flinch violently at unexpected sounds. His eyes were the most disturbing. Once bright blue, they now held a hollow, haunted quality that suggested he had seen things no man should witness. Fragmented was his story, told between fits of trembling and moments of catatonic silence that could last for hours. According to the local pastor who took him in, Hartwell would wake each night screaming about the pit of purification and the screaming that never stopped. During his more lucid moments, he spoke of arriving at the camp seeking forgiveness for killing a man in a saloon fight over a disputed card game. "The pain would cleanse my soul," Hartwell whispered to Pastor William Matthews, his voice barely audible even in the silence of the church. "Brother Malachi looked into my eyes and told me exactly what I had done. Not just the killing, but things I'd never told another living soul. He knew about the money I'd stolen from my mother before leaving Arkansas. He knew about the woman I'd left pregnant in New Orleans. He knew everything." Immediately upon arrival at the camp, the purification process began, according to Hartwell's account. All possessions were stripped from new penitents, including their clothes, and they were given rough burlap robes to wear. They were then required to confess not only the sin that had brought them to the camp but every transgression they had ever committed, no matter how minor. "Brother Cornelius would sit across from you with this ledger," Hartwell recalled, his voice taking on a monotone quality, as if reciting from memory. "He'd write down everything you said, and if he suspected you were holding something back, Brother Jebediah would use his gifts to help you remember. Those hands of his, they could cause pain you couldn't imagine. Days or even weeks could be taken by the confession process depending on the perceived honesty of the penitent. Only when the brothers were satisfied that every sin had been revealed would the physical purification begin. This started with a complete fast, 7 days with nothing but water, during which the penitent was forced to dig their own grave as a symbol of their spiritual death. The hunger was nothing compared to what came next, Hartwell continued, his entire body beginning to shake as he recalled the memories. They called it the trial of fire. Beatings with leather whips that had metal fragments sewn into them. Each lash was supposed to represent a specific sin being scourged from your flesh, but it went on for hours, sometimes days. But only the beginning was the physical torture. Ritualistic burials were described by Hartwell where penitents were placed in the graves they had dug and covered with dirt, leaving only their faces exposed. They would remain buried for varying lengths of time, sometimes minutes, sometimes hours, while the brothers prayed over them and declared their spiritual death complete. Some of them never came back up, Hartwell whispered, his eyes wide with remembered terror. Brother Malachi would stand over the graves and declare them to perfectly purified. Said they'd been called home to glory. But I saw their faces when they went under. There was no peace, only absolute terror. His description of those who didn't survive the purification process was the most horrifying aspect of Hartwell's account. According to him, the brothers maintained that death during purification was the ultimate blessing. Proof that the individual had achieved such complete spiritual cleansing that God had called them directly to paradise. They had a special ceremony for the ones who died, Hartwell recalled. Brother Malachi would read from the Bible while Brother Jebediah covered the grave, and then they'd plant a wooden cross and add the person's name to what they called the roll of the redeemed. They said these souls were the lucky ones. They'd skip purgatory entirely. As the ravings of a man broken by guilt and frontier madness, local authorities in Marshall initially dismissed Hartwell's story. After all, no one had come forward to report missing persons, and the Damnation brothers had impeccable credentials. They carried letters of recommendation from churches throughout Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, along with testimonials from grateful families whose loved ones had been transformed by their ministry. A practical man who had seen his share of frontier violence, Sheriff Tom Bradley, was particularly skeptical. "The frontier is full of men running from something," he told Pastor Matthews. "Sounds to me like Hartwell got religion the hard way and his mind snapped under the strain. These revival preachers can get pretty enthusiastic, but murder, that's a serious accusation to make without proof." The matter was quietly dropped, and within a month, Hartwell himself had disappeared. Some said he'd moved on to California. Others claimed he'd returned to Arkansas. Something more sinister was suspected by Pastor Matthews, but without evidence there was nothing he could do. Without interference, the camps continued to operate, their reputation for miraculous conversions growing with each passing season. But just the beginning of a pattern that would emerge over the following decades was Hartwell's disappearance. Throughout the South and beyond, the legend of the Damnation family's miraculous conversion spread as the months turned to years. They claimed to have saved over 1,000 souls, transforming the most hardened criminals into model citizens, who went forth to spread the gospel in the most dangerous corners of the frontier. At newspapers throughout Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana, testimonial letters arrived regularly, praising the brothers' work and describing profound spiritual transformations. A remarkably consistent pattern was followed by the testimonials. A desperate sinner would arrive at a redemption camp, undergo the purification process, and emerge as a completely new person. Within weeks of their transformation, they would feel called to missionary work in remote territories, California, Oregon, the Rocky Mountains, or deep into Indian territory. Their final letters to family members spoke of their overwhelming desire to bring salvation to the unreached, often requesting financial support for their evangelical missions. Yet for those who looked closely, troubling patterns suggested all was not as it seemed. Frequently, the redemption camps moved, never staying in one location for more than 6 months. As following God's calling to reach new populations of sinners, this was explained by the brothers, but it made tracking their activities nearly impossible for law enforcement agencies that were already stretched thin across the vast frontier. More disturbing were the accounts of families who sent wayward sons or daughters to the camps only to receive letters months later informing them that their loved ones had been so transformed by the experience that they had felt called to missionary work in distant territories. These family members were never seen or heard from again. But the Damnation brothers always had explanations and often forged letters to account for their absence. One of the first to question the brothers' claims became Mrs. Eleanor Westbrook of New Orleans when her son Thomas, a gambling addict with mounting debts, disappeared after entering a redemption camp near Shreveport in 1849. Initially, she received regular letters describing his spiritual transformation and growing desire to spread the gospel in California. Enough personal details to convince her of their authenticity were contained in the letters, and Thomas even requested money to support his missionary work. "At first I was overjoyed," Mrs. Westbrook would later tell investigators. Thomas had been heading down a dark path, and these letters suggested he had found salvation, but something about the handwriting bothered me. It looked like Thomas's writing, but there were subtle differences, the way he formed certain letters, the phrases he used. I began to suspect someone was copying his style. Deeply troubling were the results when Mrs. Westbrook hired a private investigator to locate her son in California. None of the churches or missions in the areas Thomas claimed to be working had any record of him. Either non-existent or occupied by people who had never heard of Thomas Westbrook or his missionary work were the addresses he provided in his letters. From across the region, similar stories began to emerge. A disturbing pattern in their symptoms was begun to be noticed by Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, a traveling physician who had treated several survivors of the camps. They exhibited signs of severe trauma, she would later testify before a federal tribunal. Not the peaceful countenance of the spiritually redeemed, but the hollow stare of those who had witnessed unspeakable horrors. Indeed, changed men and women were the few survivors who did return to civilization, but not in the way the brothers claimed. They spoke little, started at sudden noises, and seemed to carry a burden of knowledge too terrible to share. Their universal reluctance to discuss their time at the camps was the most disturbing, as if bound by some unholy oath of silence. Several cases that particularly troubled her were documented by Dr. Thornton. Jacob Miller, a former outlaw who had survived the purification process, displayed symptoms she had only seen in soldiers who had witnessed the worst atrocities of war. He would wake screaming about the pit and at the ceremony of ascension, she noted in her journal. When pressed for details, he would only say that some forms of salvation came at too high a price. A broken shell of her former self was how another survivor, a woman named Sarah Colby, who had sought redemption after abandoning her children to pursue a life of prostitution, returned to her family. She would spend hours staring at nothing, her sister Mary reported. Sometimes she would whisper prayers, but they weren't normal prayers. She would ask God to forgive her for the things she had seen, not the things she had done. Perhaps most telling was the case of Reverend Peter Hawkins, a Methodist minister who had volunteered to observe the Damnation brothers' methods with an eye toward incorporating their techniques into his own ministry. Not as a penitent, but as a spiritual mentor and observer, Hawkins had entered the camp. Yet just as traumatized as any other survivor, he emerged. There are forms of evil that masquerade as righteousness, Hawkins told Dr. Thornton during one of their sessions. I went seeking inspiration for my ministry and found something that shook my faith to its core. The brothers are not servants of God. They are something else entirely, something that uses our deepest spiritual needs as weapons against us. When pressed for specifics, Hawkins would only say that the true purpose of the camps had nothing to do with salvation and everything to do with exploitation of the most vulnerable members of society. He refused to elaborate, claiming that speaking the truth would only endanger others who might be tempted to investigate. Throughout the 1850s and into the 1860s, the pattern of mysterious disappearances and traumatized survivors continued. But perfect cover for the Damnation brothers' activities was provided by the chaos of the Civil War. With entire populations displaced and communication systems disrupted, it became even easier for people to vanish without explanation. However, new challenges for the brothers and new opportunities for those seeking to expose their crimes were brought by the end of the war. In the spring of 1879, nearly 15 years after the conflict's end, a young Texas Ranger named Captain James Morrison began investigating reports of missing persons throughout East Texas. A methodical man with a background in military intelligence, Morrison noticed something that others had missed, a pattern of disappearances that seemed to follow the movement of the redemption camps like a shadow across the frontier. After receiving a formal complaint from Senator Charles Whitman of Louisiana, whose nephew had disappeared after entering a damnation camp near the Texas border, Morrison had been assigned to the case. Unlike previous investigations which had been conducted by local sheriffs with limited resources and jurisdiction, Morrison had the authority and funding to conduct a comprehensive multi-state investigation. "There's something here that doesn't add up," Morrison wrote in his initial report to Ranger headquarters in Austin. "I've documented over 60 missing persons cases in the past 3 years alone, all connected to these redemption camps. That's not counting the cases from earlier years or other states where records are incomplete." Dozens of families who had lost contact with relatives after they entered the camps were led to by Morrison's investigation. The stories were remarkably similar. Loved ones would seek redemption at a damnation camp. Correspondence would continue for several weeks describing their spiritual transformation, then abruptly cease with a final letter explaining their calling to missionary work in remote locations. The ranger's suspicions deepened when he attempted to verify these missionary claims. Invariably returned as undeliverable were letters sent to the addresses provided. No record of their arrival had churches and missions in the territories where the converts had allegedly gone to serve. Most damning, Morrison discovered that several of the testimonial letters supposedly written by grateful families contained identical phrases and even identical grammatical errors. "Someone is manufacturing these testimonials," Morrison concluded in a confidential memo to his superior. "The question is whether we're dealing with fraud, kidnapping, or something worse." When he encountered a man named Tobias Fletcher in a tavern in Jefferson, Texas, Morrison's breakthrough came. Drunk and rambling was Fletcher, but his story was coherent enough to send chills down Morrison's spine. Fletcher claimed to have worked as a gravedigger and general laborer for the Damnation brothers for nearly 2 years in the mid-1870s. "I thought I was helping with the Lord's work," Fletcher whispered, his hand shaking as he reached for his bottle. Brother Malachi told me I was blessed to assist in the purification of souls, but some of those graves weren't for show. Some stayed filled permanent. He'd pray over them and declare another soul saved for eternity. But I knew what was really buried down there. Not only digging the symbolic graves used in purification rituals, but also disposing of the bodies of those who ascended during purification were included in his duties, according to Fletcher. The brothers maintained that these individuals had achieved such complete spiritual cleansing that God had called them directly to paradise. But enough bodies had been seen by Fletcher to know the difference between natural death and murder. The way Brother Jebediah would work with his hands, Fletcher continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. He claimed it was healing. But I saw what those hands could do. He could make a man suffer for days without killing him, drawing out every bit of information about family, money, property. Then, when they had everything they needed, he'd finish the job. A sophisticated operation that went far beyond simple murder was described by Fletcher. Detailed information about their victims' assets, family connections, and business dealings would be extracted by the brothers during the prolonged torture sessions. They would then use this information to forge correspondence with family members, often requesting money for fictional missionary work while providing plausible explanations for why the missionary couldn't return home or meet in person. The money kept coming, Fletcher revealed. Families would send funds to support their loved ones' work spreading the gospel. The brothers had it set up so the money would be forwarded through multiple intermediaries, impossible to trace back to them. Some families kept sending money for years, never knowing their sons and daughters were dead and buried in unmarked graves. When Morrison pressed Fletcher for details about the location of these graves, the man's demeanor changed completely. Terror replaced drunken bravado, and he began looking around the tavern as if expecting the Damnation brothers to materialize from the shadows. They got eyes everywhere, Fletcher stammered, suddenly much more sober than he had appeared moments before. People who asked too many questions about the brothers, they got a way of disappearing, too. I shouldn't have said nothing. God help me. I shouldn't have said nothing. That night, Fletcher fled the tavern and was never seen again. Some said he'd headed for California. Others claimed he'd been found dead in the swamps near Caddo Lake. The latter was suspected by Morrison, but enough information to narrow his search to a specific area near the Louisiana border where the brothers were reportedly operating their latest camp had been provided by Fletcher. Both valuable and deeply disturbing was the information Fletcher had provided. Armed with this intelligence and a growing body of evidence, Morrison knew it was time to take decisive action. A small team of trusted rangers was assembled by him and they set out for the region near Caddo Lake, where the Damnation family was reportedly operating their latest camp. Through some of the most remote and forbidding terrain in Texas took them the journey, dense forests where the canopy blocked out the sun and cypress swamps that seemed to swallow sound itself. Of 3 other rangers consisted Morrison's team, Sergeant Bill Crawford, a grizzled veteran of the Indian Wars, Corporal Miguel Santos, a former vaquero with unmatched tracking skills, and Private David Thompson, a young man whose sharp eyes and steady nerves had earned him a reputation as an exceptional marksman. For his discretion as well as his skills had each man been chosen. Morrison couldn't risk word of their investigation reaching the wrong ears. As they approached the area, disturbing signs that suggested something was fundamentally wrong with the region began to be noticed by Morrison's team. Unusually scarce seemed the local wildlife. Even the insects that normally plagued travelers in the humid East Texas climate were noticeably absent. Of unholy grounds and cursed soil where nothing would grow properly spoke the few settlers they encountered, warning them away from the area. "Ain't nothing natural about that place," warned an old trapper named Ezekiel Marsh, whom they encountered at a trading post near Marshall. "Been hunting these woods for 30 years, and I can tell you that land near the lake ain't right. Animals won't go near it, and the few that do come back changed, if they come back at all." Reports Morrison had gathered from other sources were matched by Marsh's description of the area. A section of forest where the trees grew in strange twisted patterns and where the normal sounds of wildlife fell silent was described by multiple witnesses. To Indian burial grounds or other supernatural causes was this attributed by some, but a more mundane explanation was suspected by Morrison. The presence of large quantities of decomposing organic matter could certainly affect local ecosystems. Several miles from the reported location of the redemption site, the team made camp, planning to observe the Damnation brothers' activities before making any move. To gather irrefutable evidence of criminal activity before confronting the brothers directly was Morrison's strategy. He knew that their religious credentials and reputation for good works would make it difficult to convince a jury without overwhelming proof of wrongdoing. On their first night, distant sounds that confirmed their worst suspicions were heard by the rangers. Carried on the night wind from the direction of the camp came the unmistakable sounds of human suffering, screaming, pleading, and what sounded like religious chanting in languages none of them recognized. It wasn't the cry of someone in physical pain, Morrison would later write in his official report. It was the sound of a soul in absolute torment, pleading for mercy that would never come. The worst part was how it would stop abruptly, then start again hours later, as if the suffering was being deliberately prolonged. Intermittently throughout the night, the screaming continued, sometimes accompanied by the sound of digging and what appeared to be some form of ritual ceremony. When dawn broke, the courage to conduct a preliminary reconnaissance of the area was found by Morrison and his men. Everything they thought they knew about the scope of the Damnation family's crimes would be challenged by what they discovered in the woods surrounding the camp. Like a macabre garden, fresh graves dotted the landscape, far too many to be explained as symbolic elements of religious ritual. Over 60 graves that appeared to have been dug within the past year alone were counted by Morrison, each marked with a simple wooden cross bearing only a number. But the smell that convinced Morrison they had found something genuinely horrific was. Despite the brothers' apparent efforts to manage their burial ground, the unmistakable odor of decomposition hung heavy in the humid air. Morrison's suspicions were confirmed by Private Thompson, who had served as a battlefield medic during the Indian conflicts. "That's the smell of a lot of bodies, Captain," Thompson reported grimly. "Fresh ones and old ones, too. Whatever's happening here, it's been going on for a long time." As the rangers moved closer to the camp itself, sounds that made their blood run cold began to be heard by them. From the largest tent came the rhythmic sound of metal striking flesh, accompanied by a man's agonized screaming and what sounded like religious incantations. Calm, almost conversational was the voice delivering the incantations, creating a horrifying contrast with the obvious suffering of the victim. An active torture session, probably part of the purification process Fletcher had described, was realized by Morrison. A terrible decision was faced by the ranger captain: intervene immediately and risk losing the evidence needed to expose the full scope of the brothers' crimes, or allow the torture to continue while they gathered intelligence. For him, the decision was made when the screaming suddenly stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that was somehow even more disturbing than the sounds of suffering. That any hope of saving that particular victim was gone was known by Morrison. Now their priority had to be gathering evidence and preventing future atrocities. Using hand signals, Morrison deployed his men around the perimeter of the camp. The foundation for one of the most significant criminal prosecutions in frontier history would be provided by what they observed over the next several hours. With the efficiency of a well-established business, the brothers operated, their activities following a precise schedule that suggested years of experience and refinement. Layer after layer of criminal sophistication that defied everything they thought they knew about frontier crime would soon be revealed to Morrison and his team by what they witnessed during their surveillance, leading them deeper into the investigation. A horrific routine that revealed the true nature of the Damnation brothers' operation was documented by them. Each morning began with what appeared to be a legitimate religious service, complete with hymn singing and Bible readings. In these services, new arrivals would participate, probably believing they had found genuine spiritual guidance. But as the day progressed, something far more sinister would gradually give way to the facade of religious devotion. Individual counseling sessions would begin, during which detailed confessions would be extracted by Brother Cornelius from the penitents. For hours, these sessions often lasted, and increasingly desperate pleading from inside the confession tent could be heard by the rangers. A gift for knowing exactly what people are hiding is had by Brother Cornelius, Morrison noted in his surveillance log. But I'm beginning to suspect this divine insight comes from more earthly sources: prolonged interrogation combined with psychological manipulation, and probably torture. A system for extracting not only confessions but detailed information about their victims' financial assets, family connections, and anything else that might prove profitable had been perfected by the brothers. This information would be used by them to craft convincing forged correspondence with family members, often continuing these fictional relationships for months or even years after the victim's death. Brother Jebediah's healing sessions, which were actually torture sessions designed to break down the victim's resistance, were reported to be observed by Private Thompson, who had positioned himself closest to the camp. "He's got a collection of tools that would make a Spanish inquisitor proud," Thompson whispered during one of their nightly briefings. "And he knows exactly how to use them to cause maximum pain without killing too quickly." The systematic nature of the brothers' operation was the most disturbing aspect. Over many years, their methods had clearly been developed by them, refining their techniques for extracting information, forging documents, and disposing of bodies. Obviously not their first was the camp Morrison's team was observing. The signs of a well-established operation that had been repeated many times in many locations were all shown by it. On the second night of their surveillance, what the brothers called a ceremony of ascension, their euphemism for murder, was witnessed by the rangers. A penitent who had apparently undergone several days of torture was brought to the center of the camp, where a lengthy sermon about the blessing of spiritual purification was delivered by Brother Malachi. Then ceremonially released from earthly bonds by Brother Jebediah was the victim, barely conscious and showing obvious signs of prolonged abuse. "They're not killing in a fit of religious madness," Morrison wrote in his report. "This is cold, calculated murder performed with the precision of a business transaction. The religious elements are just window dressing designed to provide psychological cover for the perpetrators and explain away the victim's disappearance." With the victim being buried in one of the numbered graves, the ceremony concluded. The ascension was recorded by Brother Malachi in a leather-bound ledger. The final step in a process that had probably been repeated hundreds of times over the past 3 decades was realized by the rangers to be what they were witnessing. But evidence that the brothers' crimes extended far beyond simple murder for profit was also discovered by Morrison's team. Hidden in the woods surrounding the camp, they found what appeared to be a workshop where documents were forged and other criminal activities planned. Clearly involved in everything from counterfeiting currency to fraud schemes that spanned multiple states had the brothers been. "Not just serial killers are we dealing with," Morrison concluded after reviewing the evidence. "One of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in American history are we looking at. These men have been using religion as a cover for every type of crime imaginable, and they've been doing it for decades." On their third day of surveillance, something that forced them to abandon their observation post and take immediate action was witnessed by Morrison's team. A family of 4, parents and 2 young children, arrived at the camp seeking family purification for what appeared to be relatively minor moral infractions. For Morrison to wait any longer for backup or additional evidence was made impossible by the sight of children being led into the camp. "I couldn't stand by and watch children become victims of these monsters," Morrison later explained to his superiors. "We had enough evidence to prove their guilt, and we had a duty to protect innocent life." To arrest the brothers during their evening service when all 3 would be together and relatively exposed was Morrison's plan. However, far more dangerous than they had anticipated was quickly discovered by the rangers to be the Damnation family. For the possibility of law enforcement intervention had obviously been planned for by the brothers, and they had prepared accordingly. Not only the 3 brothers but also several heavily armed accomplices who had been posing as camp workers were found by Morrison's team facing themselves when they moved in to make the arrests. A gunfight that lasted nearly an hour and left 2 of the accomplices dead and Sergeant Crawford wounded was what followed. That some of the camp's penitents had been so thoroughly broken by their torture that they actually tried to defend their tormentors were horrified to discover by the rangers during the battle. A form of psychological conditioning was apparently suffered from by these victims, who believed that attacking the brothers would result in their own damnation. "They begged us not to hurt their saviors," Private Thompson reported. "Some of them actually threw themselves between us and the brothers, convinced that we were agents of Satan, trying to prevent their purification. It was the most disturbing thing I've ever witnessed." Formidable opponents proved to be the brothers themselves. An excellent marksman who had obviously seen combat before was Brother Malachi, while dangerous even without weapons was Brother Jebediah's massive size and strength. An uncanny ability to manipulate people even in the midst of combat was demonstrated by Brother Cornelius, though physically less imposing, using psychological tactics to confuse and demoralize the rangers. When Morrison managed to reach the tent where the brothers kept their records came the turning point. Not only detailed accounts of their crimes but also evidence of their true identities were found inside by him. An alias was the Damnation name. The Blackwood family, wanted for murder and fraud in Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, were the brothers actually. A lie was everything about them. Their names, their religious credentials, their testimonials, all carefully crafted fiction designed to provide cover for their criminal activities, were discovered by Morrison. Career criminals who had found the perfect disguise were they, not misguided religious fanatics. With their true identities exposed and their records in the hands of law enforcement, the brothers' resistance began to crumble. One by one, they were taken into custody, though not before a final attempt to escape by taking one of the child victims as a hostage was made by Brother Cornelius. The true depth of the brothers' depravity was revealed by the standoff that followed. When Morrison attempted to negotiate for the child's release, that the child had already been marked for purification and that killing him would actually be an act of mercy was calmly explained by Brother Cornelius. "You don't understand the service we provide," Brother Cornelius told Morrison with chilling calm. "These people come to us broken, sinful, worthless. We give their lives meaning by allowing them to participate in something greater than themselves. Death during purification is the highest honor we can bestow." A perfectly placed shot that wounded Brother Cornelius without harming the child was how Private Thompson ended the standoff. Immediately, the remaining accomplices surrendered, apparently recognizing that their cause was lost. With the immediate threat neutralized and the brothers finally in custody, the grim task of uncovering the full scope of what they had stumbled upon could be begun by Morrison's team. The full scope of their crimes would be documented by what they would discover in the hours and days that followed, exceeding even their worst expectations. Their worst expectations were exceeded, and evidence of criminal activity spanning over 3 decades was provided by what they found in the camp and the surrounding area. Meticulous and damning was the brothers' record keeping. Detailed information about more than 400 victims was contained in their ledgers, including names, backgrounds, methods of execution, and the amounts of money extracted from their families through fraudulent correspondence. That the brothers had been operating since at least 1843 to 2 years before their arrival in Texas was shown by the records. Like it was a business, they kept records, Morrison reported. Each victim was assigned a number and they tracked everything. How much money was stolen? What information was extracted? Even which torture methods were most effective for different types of people. It's the most coldly methodical approach to murder I've ever encountered. Equally horrifying was the physical evidence. The remains of nearly 200 individuals were revealed by the excavation of the numbered graves, most showing signs of prolonged torture before death. From teenagers to elderly individuals ranged the victims in age and included both men and women from all walks of life. The sophisticated nature of the brothers' torture methods was revealed by forensic examination of the remains conducted by Dr. Elizabeth Thornton and a team of medical experts brought in from Austin and New Orleans. Clearly, human anatomy and psychology had been studied by them, Dr. Thornton reported. Their techniques were designed to maximize suffering while keeping victims alive as long as possible. Evidence that the brothers had been experimenting with different methods of prolonged torture, apparently seeking to develop more effective interrogation techniques, was the discovery that shocked investigators most. Signs of having been subjected to multiple different torture methods over extended periods were shown by some victims, suggesting that their suffering had been used as a form of research. Not just about extracting money or information was this, Morrison concluded. I believe genuine pleasure from causing suffering was derived by these men. The religious framework provided justification for their sadistic impulses while also attracting a steady supply of vulnerable victims. Additional evidence of the brothers' criminal versatility was yielded by the workshop Morrison's team had discovered. In addition to document forgery equipment, printing plates for counterfeit currency, stolen religious artifacts that had been modified for torture purposes, and detailed maps showing the locations of other camps the brothers had operated throughout the South were found by them. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of what appeared to be a training manual written by Brother Malachi detailing methods for identifying and exploiting vulnerable individuals. Psychological profiles of different types of victims, techniques for gaining their trust, and step-by-step instructions for extracting maximum value from each person before their death were included in the manual. Into a science had they turned human exploitation, Dr. Thornton observed after reviewing the manual. Every aspect of their operation was calculated to maximize profit while minimizing risk of detection. It's a level of systematic evil that defies comprehension. When investigators examined their correspondence with accomplices in other states, the scope of the brothers' network became clear. Not alone had the Damnation family been operating. A larger criminal organization that included forgers, con artists, and even some corrupt law enforcement officials who had been paid to look the other way were they part of. But far beyond what had been discovered at this single camp extended the brothers' crimes. From across the South, a flood of new information began pouring in as word of their arrest spread throughout the region, with information that revealed the true scope of the brothers' criminal enterprise. From across the South, letters arrived describing similar camps and suspicious disappearances dating back to the early 1840s. The disappearance of her husband in 1852 after he had attended a purification camp operated by three brothers who matched the description of the Damnations was described to authorities by Mrs. Catherine Phillips of Mobile, Alabama, in a letter. Samuel received letters from our son for nearly 2 years after he left for the camp, she explained. The letters described his missionary work in California and requested money for his evangelical efforts. We sent over $800 before the letters stopped coming. From Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, and even Indian Territory, similar stories emerged. Of camps that would operate for 6 to 12 months in remote locations before moving on, leaving behind only vague stories of successful conversions and departed missionaries emerged a pattern. A method of exploiting the poor communication systems of the frontier era had been perfected by the brothers, was revealed by the investigation. By operating in remote areas and constantly moving their base of operations,